Well, it would be a foolish man who tried to predict President Trump's next move. There is a scenario in which he surprises us all yet again by cutting a deal with Xi Jinping when they meet. I must say, I think it's a low probability scenario for one simple reason. This is working as a tool to put China under pressure. And I think the key point here is not to look at this too narrowly as simply an economic measure. We have to see it as a strategic measure. The Trump administration has moved from focusing on manufacturing jobs going to China to more broadly focusing on the strategic challenge that China poses to the United States. And that's why I think President Trump will continue to apply this pressure, because he's getting evidence that this really is having an effect, putting China under real pressure. If you think that U.S. stocks have come under pressure recently, it's absolutely nothing compared with the pain that's been inflicted on Chinese investors. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that President Trump is talking about keeping the pressure up. From a strategic point of view, he may have found China's weak spot, and President Trump's rather good at applying the pressure when he finds his opponent's weak spot.
Yeah, and listen, Neil, it's Brian Sullivan. Here's the dirty little secret around our trade with China. We buy a lot of stuff from them. They don't buy that much stuff from us, and the stuff they do buy is scrap metal, chicken feet, things like that. You know, I think it was 1/3 the economy of Maryland. President Trump understands this. My question, I guess, to you is, what's the goal? What's the win? How do you win this or you win that? The president loves to talk about winning. How do you win this?
Brian, that's a great question. If you had gone back to the earlier part of this year when the trade war began, many people in China thought that a win would constitute reducing the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. Indeed, trade negotiators went from Beijing to Washington expecting that they could cut a deal on that basis, offering to buy more stuff, say more agricultural products from the United States. But they were rather shocked to be told by President Trump that that wasn't enough and there would need to be more concessions, including concessions on their Made in China 2025 policy, which is designed to push China further up the value chain with all kinds of subsidies and things that really are not compliant with China's World Trade Organization obligations. So I think what we've seen is that the president is not just focused on what used to be his preoccupation, which was really trying to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. heartland. This is now a broader thing in which he's trying to apply pressure on China to slow the Chinese challenge down. In that sense, the definition of victory has changed. It won't be enough, I think, just to reduce the bilateral trade deficit, if it ever was. Now we have to see some sign that China is going to reduce the subsidies that it pays, the technology transfer that it engages in, some of it illicit. And that's hard for Xi Jinping to concede. And that's why I don't think that this trade war is going to be over soon. The only way it would be over soon would be if China really made some significant concessions on Made in China 2025. And I just don't think that Xi Jinping is in a domestic political position in which he can make that kind of concession without losing face.
So it sounds like it's going to be a while, no matter what happens. Neil, we have to ask you about Europe. I know you've been critical of the EU in the past. What do you think the biggest impact of the end of the Merkel era is going to bring?
Well, it depends what you mean by end, because Angela Merkel seems to be imitating the Cheshire Cat in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. She doesn't want to disappear altogether. She just wants to disappear partly. She's stepping down as chairman of her own party, or chair of her own party, at the end of this year. But she wants to stay on as chancellor. I must admit, I find that a highly implausible scenario. I would expect that this coalition government could be gone by sometime next year. I certainly can't imagine her being chancellor beyond 2019. And therefore, the big question in European politics is who will be her successor. And that has big implications. If you are a fan of the French president, Emmanuel Macron, you want somebody to come into the job who shares Merkel's vision that Europe should carry on integrating. But I'm not sure that that's what's going to happen, because I think German opinion has fundamentally shifted away from that vision of the future. So we have a vacuum in German politics, and therefore a vacuum at the heart of European politics, and that will continue to be the case until Chancellor Merkel has ceased to be Chancellor and made
Neil,
way for a successor.
Listen, I hope you're right. I mean, you've written about war many times, the pity of war, the war of the world. We've got far-right candidates in Austria that came that close to winning. We know what Marine Le Pen did in France. We see what's happening in Germany. Hire Bolsonaro in Brazil. ultimately, how does this end? Does it simply go out of vogue and we replace these leaders with others at some point in time? Or does it end another way?
Well, I think it's important not to confuse populism with fascism. I think what we're seeing is a wave of populism around the world, a kind of backlash against the excesses of globalization. And I don't think that's necessarily a disastrous thing. One can quibble about some aspects of it, but I think there are good arguments that ordinary people felt that free trade and mass migration and indeed the increasingly financial globalization of the world had all gone too far. So I don't think this necessarily is some kind of fast track to Armageddon, to World War III. I think it's more likely that we have a populist phase in politics, and then maybe if it doesn't deliver results to the people who voted for it, that phase may give way to a populism of the left, or perhaps a return to the center. I think it's a mistake to assume that simply because politics deviates from the centrist politics that so many political establishments favor, that we're necessarily heading for disaster. I think the most likely scenario in the coming couple of years is that the U.S. China relationship goes from trade war to Cold War. But notice the word is Cold War. And as for Europe, I think the probability of war in Europe is really extraordinarily low. Pacifist sentiments at extremely high levels. The only real thing that could cause a conflict in Europe would be if Mr. Putin decided to go into the Baltic states, and I don't think he's going to take that risk.